can't stay silent for another day. I have the right amount of booze in me to relive this one more time, but not so much that I'm incoherent. It was the summer of 1992 and I had decided to live the best summer of my life before becoming a productive member of society. I fished and camped and hiked throughout my entire youth, but that was all about to come to an end with two simple words: I do. I left my parents' house early that morning with my pistol on my hip. I had a rifle. The park I was headed to was a couple of hours away and not often visited by anyone. I had heard all the wild stories about it and I was anxious to see it for myself. At first glance, I was not disappointed. Off in the distance, I could see the open patches high up on the hills, bordered by clusters of trees. To the left of the road was a dry riverbed that would make an easy trail for me. Time stood still in this place. Old, moss-covered rock fences were the only evidence that human hands had ever been there. I was thrilled as I took my first step, wondering what lay before me. If only I had known. After a couple of hours and a few stops, I came to a spot where the creek narrowed with a 3-foot bank. A cluster of trees sat to the left, and to the right was an open field of wildflowers. The wind that I had heard whistling through the trees all day was gone, and I was suddenly aware of something dark. It was a gut-twisting feeling that came out of nowhere. I stopped and I held my breath, afraid even to exhale, though I had no idea why. And then I saw it. Up ahead, 100 yards to my right, was something dark. It was as if that feeling had taken physical form. There was no movement or sound, yet I felt it demanded my attention. So slowly, I reached for my binoculars, and immediately I was hit with a blast of "Don't do that." I stopped dead for a single moment before continuing to lift them to my eyes. Why didn't I listen to that inner voice? There up ahead in the bushes was a thing, a massive black hairy thing. I tried to tell myself it was a bear, but I couldn't lie that well. It was a little afternoon and the sun was high in the sky. The downward shadow it cast made the thing's face darker. Its eyes were cloaked under its massive brow, but somehow I knew it was glaring at me. I could see its fangs. Yes, it had fangs. It was contrasted against its black face. There was no definition to its chest, but it was incredibly wide. I felt sick. My knees buckled and my head began to swim. And I reached for the riverbank to steady myself, and I saw the creature vanish. Somewhere inside me, I felt a bit of relief, thinking it had left, and within seconds it popped its head up again. Now it was 70 yards away. And it stared its dark, evil intent at me through black, vacant eye sockets. It seemed to be saying in my mind, "If only you hadn't looked." It stretched up and over as if it was getting a better look, and then it vanished again. I stumbled backwards, fighting the urge to turn and run, and my mind raced, and some will tell you that they think of their loved ones, or they might say the idea of becoming a part of a missing 411 phenomenon crossed their minds. Well, that wasn't the case for me. I thought about how this thing might attack me and how bad it would hurt and how long it would take to die. And I wondered if it would rip me apart or eat me while I still struggled to get away. Every thought was a horror worse than the last. Now I heard it making noise, as if it wanted me to be scared. I had heard that blood was sweeter when adrenaline was dumped into it, so I wondered if this was what the thing was doing. It stomped and broke branches and huffed as it moved through the brush, and again it raised its head, only 40 yards away. Its details were now more defined. It was more disgusting than I imagined, its face glistening in the sun. A patch on its chest also shimmered as silvery strings ran from the corners of its mouth. That mouth slit its face in two. It was wide and slightly parted, giving it an almost grinning effect. Its head and body were all one. If it had a neck, it was surrounded by pure muscle. If I were to describe it honestly, I would only be able to say that it was big. It was black and it was horrific. Again, it vanished, and each time it did, it moved so fast that it blurred out of sight. It seemed unnatural in its movement. This sick game of peekaboo was more than my mind could take in, and I struggled, and part of me was resigned to death, while another part, a more primal part, wanted to run. Still, another part of me said, I need to fight. These emotions combined to create a mind-warping, stomach-churning mess. I slowly began to back up, afraid to look behind me or even turn ahead. The noises were getting louder and closer, and I began to say the Lord's Prayer. It popped its head up again from 20 feet away. It was emboldened, and it stood erect, craning to see me. It rose well above the bushes that I guessed were probably 6 feet tall. It was running out of brush, and soon it would be in the clearing across from me. I began to cry. I knew this was the end. There was nothing I could do to avoid it. And I snapped out of my self-pity as the thing disappeared once again into the foliage. Then it stepped out of the brush, slightly bent at the waist, its arms hanging at its sides. They were tipped with claws that I couldn't stop staring at. Its body heaved with each breath that grew increasingly faster as it seemed to be working itself into a frenzy. And it wheezed when it inhaled. And faster it huffed in and out. And then it went silent. In slow motion, I watched it as it bent its knees and leaned forward and threw its arms back ready to jump. And I was falling backwards when all hell broke loose. The silence was shattered by something exploding to my left, and it showered the creek bed with shrapnel. I felt a gust of wind as a reddish-brown blur flew out of the chaos and hit the creature square on. Only an empty space loomed before me now. Then I was hit by a sound wave that came from the other side of the brush, and it vibrated me to my core. It was followed by deep thumps that shook the ground and rattled my teeth. I rolled and tried to force my body to move, but I couldn't. I could only lie there feeling and hearing what sounded like a freight train and bombs bursting all around me. I'm not sure how long it was before I could move again. To my horror, when I finally did, I was moving toward the source of the noise. Almost trance-like, I inched to the edge of the creek and peered over the side. 30 feet away, two monsters were fighting. They were biting and clawing and clubbing and tearing at each other. It was a dog fight. Each was twisting and turning to get the upper hand, and jaws snapped and heads bobbed and weaved. It was primal, and it was vicious, and I clamped my hands over my ears to block out the screaming that was emitting from each bite. Finally, I realized what had saved me. It was a Sasquatch. I had watched all the shows and seen all the trail cam footage. As I was beginning to understand, it became distracted for a moment, which allowed the other creature to get its feet up against the Bigfoot's chest, and with a massive push, it flipped the Sasquatch onto its back and leapt on him, biting down on his upper thigh. The scream of pain was so much louder than the other sounds I had heard, and once again I fell to the ground and I covered my ears. The tables had turned. The young Sasquatch was now in trouble. He was the one fending off the clubbing blows. He was losing. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. If that creature won, I would be dinner again. And then I remembered my gun. I knew I couldn't kill it, but maybe I could distract that thing long enough to give the Sasquatch a chance. I took a deep breath and I raised my rifle. The monster's head was moving too fast to get a clean shot. Most of its body was moving too fast. And then, with an almost perverse pleasure, I realized the only part of it that wasn't moving too fast was its backside. I almost snickered at the thought of shooting it there. I started to pull the trigger, and a massive scream, louder than anything I had heard so far, burst through the air from my far right. And spinning around, I saw an even larger beast break through the tree line and rush headlong into the fray. The monster straightened up and braced for the attack, but it was too late. The larger squatch had already reached it, hitting it in its back so hard that the top of its head snapped back and bounced off its massive back with a resounding crack, and it crumpled forward to its face. Seconds passed like hours as the two watched, waiting for movement that never came. A kick to the side confirmed that the monster would never move again. The victor raised his head and sniffed the air and screamed a victory roar before grabbing the monster's ankle, dragging it off into the trees. The first Bigfoot now turned its focus on me. As it stood up, the sight of its 9-foot frame sent a shudder through me. It was studying me as it cautiously inched forward. And when I realized that I was pointing my rifle at it with my finger on the trigger, I lowered my rifle, and that appeared to give it some relief. However, it began to move faster toward me. Maybe it was fear, and maybe it was the crash after such an adrenaline rush. I couldn't say. All I know is that the edges of my vision began to darken and the earth was beginning to spin, and the last thing I saw was the ground flying up to meet my face. When I awoke, my head was pounding and I felt ill. I rested my head between my knees and inhaled through my nose and exhaled through my mouth, fighting the urge to gulp the cool night air. And then I looked around. I was propped up against my truck with my rifle at my side. Had this been a nightmare? Had I never left my parking spot? Had I nodded off instead and had a bad dream? I began to question myself mentally, replaying the events that led up to this moment. It had to have been a dream. I convinced myself that I had never left my truck. I got myself up off the ground and turned to get in, wanting nothing more than to get home. That was when I saw the huge handprint on the hood of my truck, placed exactly where someone would have placed their hand to steady themselves while setting something on the ground. And I froze, and suddenly aware of the cold, wet spot in my pants where I had soiled myself, had to face the truth. I've never moved so fast in my life. I never looked back, nor have I ever told this story to anyone. For years, that thing stalked my dreams. Sometimes it caught me. On those occasions, I would wake up screaming and flailing my arms. Those dreams dropped a year ago, so I figured it was time to share my story. I only hope that telling it doesn't invite that creature to make a nocturnal comeback.